Thanks very much for the super kind introduction. This meeting is being recorded. I just got it? Yeah, okay, all right. So indeed, I wanted to start a bit with saying something about my background to then motivate why I'm doing what I'm doing. So I studied mathematics and musicology, and you see me here with a puppet of myself. That's the opening of an exhibition that I have organized in our science faculty on, I'm a scientist, showing very different types of scientists. And when I saw that picture, I was like, yes, that's like a perfect picture of this dual person I had been since I studied these subjects in parallel, where a lot of people were asking, why the heck are you doing this? And when I started, I only had the love for music and the love for mathematics and some conviction that mathematical structures and musical structures had a lot in common. And I hoped this would lead to something. And so the first thing that this led me to was mathematical music theory. But when I started my PhD in that field, I very quickly also included computer science or informatics, because this allowed me to take mathematical models and apply them to actual musical pieces. And I really wanted, via computation, I really wanted to learn concrete things about musical pieces. And this is what computation did for me. So my starting point was something we call now computational music analysis, looking at structures, which is something that musicologists or music theorists usually do in their daily work. And the question is, can we do some of these things with the help of the computer? And for me, one way of wanting to do this was as a reflection method, that if I'm trying to teach the computer a certain method, how I think it goes, and then I look at the results the computer produces, whether that kind of is in sync of what my intuition was. So it's kind of a reflection tool. But if you move further than looking at one piece and looking into many pieces, then it's obvious that we would, in many cases, not want to do this manually. So it's, then really a help to be able to do this by means of computation. So that was my starting point. And that will also be the first part of the talk. In recent years, I also, I'm now working at a computer science department. And I also became very interested now with the knowledge that I gain by, applying computational models to music. Is there something I can do with the knowledge? Yeah. And so one thing that I became very interested, how can we employ these structures or patterns that we discover with computational methods and then employ them in music and interaction? And I have here an example that was introduced to me in 2019. You see here a group called The Bridge. And perhaps you see the two people in front that have computers. And they have an instrument in front of their mouth that's called the magic flute, which is an instrument that has been constructed by the guitarist, who is a therapist, who has been working many years with kids that have muscle atrophy. So, they lose their ability to move, and they also have to train their muscles with their lungs with daily breathing exercises. And these breathing exercises are often very boring, and they had apparatus where many kids said, I really don't want to do this. And he said, well, playing an instrument, playing wind instrument, blowing into something, that is training your lungs. So how about we turn it around and make a musical instrument out of that? And that's what he did. So he constructed this magical flute. So basically all they have to do is, so they need to blow in, and then they can steer the pitch by means of just moving their head. And just to show you an example of when this small ensemble played together with the Dutch student orchestra, just to give you an example how that sounds. right, I stop here, you get the idea. So I thought this was a fantastic example how you can use computer technology to integrate people into a musical performance who would otherwise not have been able to participate in it. Yeah. And so we collaborated since then with Ruud van der Wel, who, by the way, also was won a prize from the Dutch king for all of his efforts of, developing these instruments for the kids. And I think they are even traveling worldwide with this little band and trying to distribute the technology to other countries. And so that was something, this is something, a really worthwhile cause that I would like to also contribute to. And that's the second part of my talk on how we can use, patterns and structures we discover in music in musical interactions. In this kind, sorry, not heard it. So in this case, one of the things they asked us was that because not normally a gesture is part of live performance, they ask us, can we in any way create like additionally an avatar that makes those movements that are not there in a live performance. And so we had like one small project together on automatic music-driven animation generation. If you only have an expressive performance, how you add gestures for that. All right, so basically when people say, what are you doing with music information computing? I say, well, I look at musical structures that humans often are very good in understanding them implicit. And by using computation, I need to make these explicit, these structures. And I evaluate them and interpret them on corpora. And by doing this, I hope I also learn a bit more about how humans do this implicitly. And I will show you some examples, for instance, on how we perceive melodies. And then the second part is I want to use or develop interactive technology based on the understanding of music this creates, and then, enable new forms of interaction with music for people in all kinds of contexts, such as education or health. Okay. And these are the two parts. So I will start with computing the musical structures and then applying them in interactions for today. All right. Now, what are my examples? So I've had here a picture. I said I'm working at a computer science department. So this was the picture of my colleagues showing them, look, this is how music information computing has to do with lots of things that we do in the department, like geometry, interaction technology, functional programming. Interesting for you now is that I will talk about music and geometry. How can we model musical structures by means of looking at rhythm and meter? So I will introduce a model of the model of inner-metric analysis, where we take a digitized musical file and then we extract XM profiles. And that is a mean of saying how easy or difficult would it be to tap along, for instance, to a certain piece or to move along. Then my next example comes more from digital humanities, from the analysis and allowing access to a musical corpus, in this case, a large Dutch folk song database that we worked on. And then in my last part, I will talk about games in the context of health and well-being, employing rhythm and meters, for instance, for training rhythmic skills of children with autism. And I have another example on musical attention control training in which we employ those patterns. Okay, now let's start with rhythm and meter. Okay, now as I said, what we're doing is with this model is we take digitized file and we extract metrical accents to figure out whether or not a musical piece is regular, and if so, what regularity is the case. The original model that is based upon comes from algebraic topology, from simplicial complexes. If anyone wants to know, I'll give you one short idea what this is about. Here's an example, is a piece in 3/8, and we know if a piece is in 3/8 and we don't see that it's written in 3/8, we still can perceive it by means of the accent structure that is in a piece that is written in 3/8, so that we can count along 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, yeah, with high accents on the downbeats and weaker accents on the offbeats in between. Now, the question is, how do these accents come into the music? Where do they come from? And if you ask music theorists or music people and music cognition, and they say one example of explaining that same piece that I just showed is from Harald Krebs, who said, well, if there's a musical piece, there are several layers of motion or pulses present. And in this case, you see here 3 layers. And how Cape says, well, and then I define the meter of a work as the union of all layers of motion. And that means that you take all series of regularly recurring pulses. So these are all notes that are equally spaced. And then the argument is, so how does from this then the accents arise, where the idea is that the more of these pulses coincide in those places, you have a high accent, and if only few of them coincide, you have fewer accents. Okay, so we take these nested pulses, and then here many of them coincide, so that's a strong pulse. Here only two of them, that's a weaker pulse, a weaker accent, and in between it's even lower, the accent. So that's the idea that I found in how people in music cognition argue where those accents came from, which is interesting because it is somewhat similar to the model of inner metric analysis, even though this came from a complete different background. So I won't explain all the details of the model, but let me just say this. What we are doing is we forget almost everything about the piece. We forget, for instance, every pitch. We're only interested in where a note begins, the note onsets. And this is here, this series. And then we look into all pulses that we can find in this set of onsets. That means notes that were equally spaced. Yeah, so you see here 4 notes that are equally spaced. Here are 3, and we look for all of them. Okay, and then the intuition is the same. We calculate then the metric weight of one note based on all the pulses that coincide. You can see this one here gets the highest metric weight because most of them coincide with this note. Okay, so that's basically kind of the intuition that lies behind the model. And it's very similar to how people in music theory or cognition would argue where those accents come from. Now, how does the analysis look like? So here's the beginning of Mozart's Jupiter Symphony in 4/4. So what you can see is from left to right is the time axis, and the y-axis gives us the strength of the accent per note. So the higher the blue line, the greater is the metric accent, and the gray bar lines in the background give us where Mozart has notated the bar lines. So the model itself does not know anything about the bar lines. Yeah? It's just given here as like the background. Now, if we would zoom into this, we could see, well, that's the perfect metric accent structure of a 4/4. Yeah? We always have the greatest metric accent on the beginning. Then we have a second level in the middle. And then we have the 2 and the 4, and the 8th notes here are really, or 16th notes are really on the lowest level. So that kind of reproduces, okay, this seems to be a regular piece in 4/4. Now, is this always the case? No, it's not. I have here an example from Stravinsky's Danse Sacrale. So do you think that this is a regular structure or an irregular structure? Who would vote for regular? No one? Irregular? And you can also see this by what Stravinsky is doing, right? So he's changing the bars kind of constantly. I have to be honest, when I listened to it, I thought, wait a moment, this is regular. This somehow sounds regular. Is he just cheating, making it difficult by changing those bar lines all the time? However, when I tried to tap along and to predict when the next note came, I was very often wrong. And so I said, okay, let's analyze it. And indeed, he did not cheat. It really is not regular. Okay, so that's a way of capturing, when there is metric regularity. Then I have another interesting piece by Webern, the piano variations. Now, there's a lot going on in this piece, definitely way more than just onsets. Yeah? There's very interesting pitch structures going on. And this piece has been analyzed by several researchers, definitely by David Lewin. I think he's even written 2 articles about it. And he said, well, if I listen to the piece and he analyzed, the pitch structure and the chord structure, and he said, well, I think this is more like a 3/8 than a 2/4. So he argued the underlying structure is a different one. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. And what happens if we again get rid of the pitch? You know, what would we see? And then what we see is now it's interpreted as a 2/4. And I think probably can agree that's hard to see any irregularity. However, if I take the same weight and interpret it as a 3/8, as David Lowen has argued, then you see here an area where the greatest metric weight are always at the beginning of the bar. And interestingly, this is only in the first half of the composition. So there is also from the metric structure, or just from the rhythmic structure, an argument that it's probably more likely to be perceived in a 3/8 than a 2/4, without looking at any pitch structures, even though it is only part of the composition. Now, my last example is, so we also used it a lot for simply automatic detection of meter from MIDI files, because there are many contexts where you need to know in a MIDI file. For instance, if you want to extract chords, you need to know, where is the bar beginning, where are the downbeats, and meter annotations in MIDI are not always correct. So therefore, we suggested a automatic meter detection, introduce an automatic meter detection algorithm with Buster Haas. And we also used it for finding important genre characteristics. And I have here an example from ragtime, which I'm sure you all know. It's like here. So that's like the most, well-known ragtime. And what's typical for ragtime is that usually the left hand kind of, keeps the beat 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, and then the right hand kind of, makes all kinds of interesting rhythmic structures. And what you can see here I've just chosen one example, is that you systematically, if you analyze the left hand, you see again a regular structure of, great metric weights on the beginning and in the half bar. And the right hand has usually, depending on how much syncopation there is, the great metric weights exactly on the offbeats, so complementary to what the left hand is doing. And this depends on how much syncopation there is. And that's, a nice kind of finding or for how you might use something like this, for instance, for genre detection, because that's a very typical thing for ragtime music. Okay. Now, so far about a model for, extracting rhythmic structures. Now, this also came into use when we collaborated with the MIR Institute in Amsterdam on a large collection of Dutch folk songs, where the question was whether we could, from the MIR Institute to the computer science department, whether we could build an online search engine that gives access to the collection and allows to search for the musical content online. So by the time we started, usually people had to call in to the MIR Institute if they were interested, in a certain song, and then they needed to go to their files. And they said, wait a moment, in the age of digitization, couldn't we, if we digitize them, simply allow an online search for them? And that was the task we had. Now, what's important is that all of these Dutch folk songs have been transmitted orally, so not by notation. And that means there is a process going on that we try to depict this picture, that you give it, to the next generation by singing, listening, singing, listening. And as you can imagine, people usually don't exactly reproduce what they have heard. Yeah? So there are little variations come in through this process of oral transmission. And so they have in this collection of thousands of folk songs, lots of them that are actually rather similar, and where the musicologists argued, we think they all form a tune family. And tune family means that they probably go back in history to one piece. And so they group them into these tune families. The historic process in itself is, of course, lost. So all we have now are the recordings and the similarity. And they asked us, could you build us a search engine that can find, these tune families, or can sort our melodies according to similarity? And so, yeah, so by that time they had already categorized 7,000 songs. So they really had, worked for years and years on this collection. Now, this was a very, very interesting task for us. And we asked them, great, tell us, what is the similarity based upon? So we wanted to know certain features they used. And then their first answer was, well, it's actually very easy. You just listen to the songs and which is a very typical answer of an expert in something who has done something for years and years and years and years, but is not an expert in explaining how on earth they are doing. Yeah. And so they said, they invited us, you can listen yourself. And we really had to say, yes, we can listen, but we will not gain your expertise that you have gained over so many years. So we would sit around the table, we would listen to the songs, we would look at the songs, and then we would ask, okay, so what do you see here and what do you see here? And then they started mentioning something like, yeah, now here's a global contour that I pay attention to, or here's a little local contour aspect, or here's the rhythmic structure. And so they did come up with features in the end. And so we then agreed on, okay, for us to be able to systematically understand, what your similarity is based upon, we designed together with them an annotation study. So we tried to pick up the words they used, and then they would try to, as systematically as possible, describe how they use them. What does it mean they look into patterns or they look into tonal structures? And then they annotated for us 360 songs. And rated these features according to how important they were for them for their similarity rating into a tune family. And what came out of that annotation study was that the most important feature for them was patterns that repeat between different songs. So I have here an example. Oops, no. So here's the first melody.
In Engeland woont een koopman rijk en oud, die uit een dochter Margaretha was uitdaan.
Okay, the second one.
Daar was een koopman rijk in leder, die had een dochtertje al op die zat.
Right, I hope you could perceive that it's definitely not the same melody, but there is some similarity in it. And the red pattern and the blue pattern are patterns that the musicologist annotated for us and said, these are the patterns that I remember from the other melody. And that's why I think they are related. Now, while we are doing all of this, these annotations, we were on the site still searching for what is, the best algorithm that we could try out. And what turned out to be the best in the end, and that the song that the search engine is now based upon. So you can see, you can click on find similar melodies, and then you get a ranked list. And the similarity is really only based on the melodies in this case. But the underlying algorithm is an alignment algorithm that is inspired from bioinformatics. And it says that if you have two sequences of symbols, an association scoring function and a gap scoring function, you can find an algorithm that finds the optimal alignment. Now, in our case, we experimented around, specifically Peter von Kranenberg in his PhD thesis experimented around what features should we take and to describe those melodies. And we figured out that we are most successful if we take the pitch, the metric weight from the model I just explained before, and the position within a phrase, because the better they correspond, the higher, the better is the match to correctly classify the melody. So how does this look like in practice? So we take one melody, and then we take another melody, and the alignment algorithm automatically aligns these melodies. So you can see here, for instance, the part where if they have different length, you need to have insertions. Yeah, and here it's okay, I need to insert something here. And then you see numbers per note, and these numbers are added up in the end to an overall similarity value. So that says, okay, this melody and this melody is similar according to that number. And this number or this model was so successful that we could reproduce 90% of the tune families. So it really corresponded to how the musicologist did classify the songs. Now, first of all, it tells you that musicologists, even if they cannot very well explain what they are doing, can do their things incredibly systematic, because otherwise we would not have had a chance finding a computation model that kind of reproduces what they have done. But there's nothing here about patterns, because we take every note into account. It's not like we just take, oh yeah, here's something important and here's something less important. So there was nothing about patterns in this algorithm. As I said, we can, classify them like 99%, and you could say, okay, our task is done, right? You have your search algorithm. We could stop now. But as musicologists, we were of course interested in, but why is this discrepancy that musicologists think there is something in the patterns, while the computational modeling works best with the alignment. And so we didn't stop at this point with our research. We said, okay, what could we do about the patterns? There are so many also ethnomusicologists from other American or English folk songs also arguing that you need to look into the patterns, so that we stayed interested in this. And then we said, okay, what we could do as computer scientists is the following. So we wanted to know how we can evaluate the role. Is there still something correct about the intuition that the musicologists had? And we said what we could do is we could, if they say, okay, something very important is in those patterns, how about we throw away the rest of the melody and then try to classify it? We will hardly be better than 99%, that's not possible, but we can still see if it's still good enough. How about, for instance, we compare it, we then construct a sparse melody out of those patterns that they have indicated that are, the correct ones. And then we could, for instance, compare that to a random melody, just randomly taking out something, and then compare how good is then the classification. Yeah. And so we created a pipeline of, taking the data set, extracting the patterns, constructing a sparse melody, and then, determine the similarity, and then classify the songs in the tune families. And then we had two values. One is the accuracy, so how accurate is our classification, and the coverage. Coverage means how many notes were we able to leave out. I mean, if you cover everything, you have the same as the beginning. So you want the coverage to be low so that you can throw away many notes and just reduce it to a number of patterns. Now here is the results that I will talk you through. So you see on the x-axis is the coverage, and on the y-axis is the accuracy. So we want to be in the upper left corner by saying we can throw away a lot of material and we are still very accurate in the classification into the tune families. Now, what you see here is, first of all, here's our reference. That was the original melody, the original algorithm, the alignment one, where we take each and every note into account. And then this little star here, that is the patterns extracted from the musicologist. And as you can see, we also, oh, sorry, I didn't mention it. We did not only use the patterns of the musicologist, but we compared it with state-of-the-art pattern discovery algorithms by that time, because we said, well, it would be really convenient if we could automatically find those patterns, because, those annotations by humans are very costly. So if we have the next data set, we could simply automatically extract the patterns. That would be really nice. But we figured out that all of the algorithms are way below of what the humans did produce. Okay, so we learned for the human annotated patterns, we could throw away 60% of the notes. That's more than half of the melody we could throw away. And the classification accuracy only dropped to 0.88, which is still pretty nice. That's very nice. So it's kind of, again, a confirmation of, what the musicologist had annotated for us. But we discovered our pattern discovery output is not yet where we would like it to have. And so this then inspired, more research into, okay, what are then the differences between the annotated, the humanly annotated and the discovered pattern? Because if you understand that, perhaps we can improve then how we discover these patterns. And that is the topic of the PhD thesis of Iris Yupin Reng, who is defending her thesis actually next Monday. And so she would look into many, many different pattern discovery algorithms that exist for music, and trying in, different comparisons of how we compare them with each other and how do we compare them with humans to figure out in what context might what algorithm be the best, and which one is most different from what humans do. And without saying everything she did, because we don't have enough time, I do want to say one example here because it connects to the very first model we talked about. So one approach she did was, okay, let's take humanly annotated patterns and algorithmically discovered patterns and random passages. Let's describe them with lots of musical features. And then let's see whether automatic classifiers can classify them. Ideally, you don't want classifiers to be able to say, oh yeah, I know this is a humanly annotated pattern or this is an automatic. You want them to be indistinguishable. That's the reality. That's what we would want to have. But we figured out it's not the case. So the classifiers really can distinguish whether something has been extracted from an algorithm or is coming from a human. And by looking at the features, what were the features that distinguish them the most, it turned out it was, in most of the cases, the rhythm. So there is still something that we need to improve in how the pattern discovery algorithms treat rhythm. That's one example of difference we found. She then moved into modeling transformations. So as musicologists, you know that we have these typical transformations, what we do with musical motifs, right? Transposition, what is the inverse, the retrograde, augmentation, all of these things. And from computer science, the Haskell language is a very suitable programming language to encode and easily check these transformations. And that was then the next step in her thesis. And again, she looked into what are the transformations that characterize human annotations and those from algorithms. And here is one example from our paper in 2019. So you see on the left, the humans, and on the right are the automatically discovered patterns. And this is like a pie of how many percentages we find for which category. And for now, the most interesting fact is that this large black chunk here are all the transformations we cannot explain by any of these basic transformations that we defined, like augmentation, transposition, and so on and so forth. So it looks like the algorithms find way more complex transformations than those that the humans discover. This does not need to be a problem. For instance, if you use pattern discovery, for instance, for compression, in compression contexts, it could be totally fine that algorithms tend to find those that humans would not annotate. But obviously, as in the case for the Dutch folk songs, we figured out, well, but we can't even use the automatically discovered, for instance, for compression. So obviously there is something, again, also on the transformational side that we need to improve. All right, now I think, and of course, if you're a musicologist, you also know that humans tend to disagree a lot about what are the patterns that you might extract from a piece. So we also worked on how can we offer automatic annotation tools and not starting by, circling them on paper. And we did find, of course, that it depends also whether, what notation you give to them, but also that people that come from the same music theoretic school tend to agree with each other more than other students coming from a different music theoretic school. So that's also ongoing research. How do we even argue how much humans agree with each other? And what do we expect then from the algorithms? Is there any sort of ground truth or rough ground truth that humans would agree that an algorithm would be expected to kind of reproduce. Okay, now we have developed in MIR lots of computational models, and I've just shown you now 2. We also have quite rigorous evaluation methods. We could say they work to a varying extent depending on the context. So here our evaluation method were the annotations from the musicologists. And the question is, can we apply them yet? Meaning, can we go to this part of developing new forms of interaction? And here I would like to start with an example that is a collaboration with music therapists from the Utrecht Medical Center. And that is about training rhythmic skills of children with autism. Now, this whole idea started when we organized a workshop in 2019, where we brought together people in computer science, music cognition, and music therapy on the topic of music, computing, and health. And what came there from the music therapist side was there was great interest in developing serious or applied games that patients or clients can train certain tasks at home, because usually, the time that they can come to the therapist is limited, like once a week, for instance. And if they can't practice anything at home during the following week, they often say, well, they really start again from scratch. So the therapists argued it would really be nice, to have kind of, in addition, applied games so that they can train at home. And another method, another wish was that MIR methods could actually support diagnosis and intervention, for instance, in describing or in extracting structures that arise from music improvisations within therapy. Okay, now let me go back to why then such a rhythm game. So we are collaborating with a music therapist who uses cards that you see here on the right side, where animal names are coupled with pictures, and they use the animal names to train simple rhythms like olifant, olifant, Leo, olifant, olifant, Leo. So there's no musical, annotation involved. And the task was now, can we in some way build a at-home training that they can do in between the sessions? And you cannot use such a game and directly translate it into a video game. So you really need a very different approach of how this would work within a video game. Perhaps a little bit more about why a rhythm game at all. This has to do with training sensory processing issues. That is something that for a lot of children with autism spectrum disorder is the case. So they have trouble with the incoming stimuli. And by sensory processing, we mean it's our ability how we analyze and integrate incoming sensory information in the brain, which is an unconscious reaction to the stimuli before it gets conscious. And it affects our real-time behavior, which are behaviors that follow those mental actions immediately. And it is an indicator of sensory processing then, our real-time behavior. And there have been a lot of studies showing that music is a very good way to assess this relation between the sensory processing and the real-time behavior responses. And one way of doing this is rhythm. So you can use rhythms to assess whether or not there are issues, underlying issues in those, because not everyone from the spectrum has it. And you can also use it to train them. So basically, music therapy has shown that you can help detecting those sensory processing issues, but also can, and by doing so, you can then support the diagnosis, but also the treatment by means of rhythmic training, okay? And one other argument why it's specifically important for this group is that they can play it in the safety of their home. So the UMCU is really a huge, absolutely huge hospital. So even I stress out if I go into this building. So it's really great if they have something that they can play at home. Now, the game idea that our students came up with that and the game goal is that there is a blind character that needs to learn sword fighting. And it needs to learn sword fighting by listening to the rhythm that's played by the teacher. Yeah? So the game works that you're listening to the rhythm that you hear produced in the background. And then you need to reproduce the rhythm. And when you reproduce the rhythm, the avatar here is steered and that little figure starts sword fighting. So you basically help the figure to learn sword fighting by listening. Now, this is a project with a lot of different expertise, as you can see here. It's still ongoing. One of the things that we learned was that now if you move away from just music into a game, it gets immediately multimodal. That means you need to think about how do visual and auditory cues interact. So do you not distract them with your visual information, and how do you help them to concentrate on the auditory cues and not use the visual cues? You can also use MIR to compute different levels of rhythmic complexity, because the game is supposed to go, so we have different levels where you start with very simple rhythms and then make them more and more complex. The question is, what is rhythmic complexity? And we are going to gather the responses and analyze the interactions with the musical structure in order to then determine what the next game level is and to provide them feedback. Oh, yes, so that's ongoing. That was the last slide on that rhythm game Kendo. Now, another project that we are running is on the topic of musical attention control and training. That again comes from music therapy, in this case specifically from neurologic music therapy. And the goal here is to optimize attention processes in the context of cognitive rehabilitation. And also this usually requires multiple interventions per week and really a broad variation of musical exercises. So basically what it does is so that a therapist and the patient improvise together, and the patient needs to listen to what the music therapist is playing, and they need to react to changes that were introduced by the therapist. There exist different protocols on how to do this, but a very important principle is repetition and change, and prediction versus unprediction. So if you need to play along, obviously there needs to be a certain amount of prediction in the music. But then there comes this element that you need to figure out, oh, something has changed and now I need to react. And this is how attention is trained, that they cannot go into an autopilot kind of mode. And this is applied in a variety of contexts, for instance, for Parkinson's disease or patients for ADHD patients. And we collaborated with Loreen Hackford, who has a group of Parkinson patients who are very, very eager to have some training at home with the help of such a game. And the difficult task is now, how do you make this, improvisation of two person into a game so that you can play that at home? Now, our first prototype is a very simple idea that the game emulates the role of the therapist. And the game is based on the idea that the player needs to help out a band. They need to, because their guitarist was sick, became sick, and so they need to jump in, and they don't know the music yet, but they're simply invited to the stage and then press a button. When you press the button, that's the only thing they need to do. A chord sequence is generated automatically to the music that is playing. Yeah, and the pattern is really big because it needed to be a very simple interface, easy interface, and also not to miss in case you have troubles with your fingers. And so there is an automatic music generation method in the background, with certain rhythms, keys, chord progression, and tempo to allow enough variation. So whenever there is a change, for instance, in the chord progression or the tempo, or there's pause, the player has to adapt their own playing along with what's playing in the music, with what's playing in the game. Okay. We have a first experiment. We didn't immediately go to the Parkinson patients, We first tried it on 21 non-Parkinson patients, healthy adults, and we had a control group of 22 participants who did not play the game. The game group played the game 10 times on 10 different days within 2 weeks. And each session consisted of 4 songs with 3 minutes each. And then they all did a cognitive test to measure their attention before and after, so that we could check whether indeed their attention was improved or not. And here are the comparisons. So you have the gamer group, it's white dots, and the control group. So the control group only did those attention tests once at the beginning of the 10 days and then again at the end of the 10 days. And if you look at it, we said, oh, great. The game group did improve, but it's not statistically significant yet. Okay, so it's not really, which is perhaps not that super surprising because this is a group of healthy participants and the game so far is yet really, really simple. But what we did learn from our experiments is that it is very essential to give them feedback, that we absolutely need a dynamic difficulty adjustment because we realized people who had higher musical experience really didn't enjoy the game as much as the others, so it was not challenging enough. So we really need to, have an automatic adaptation, and probably also our music generation rhythm was still very, very simple. So there is a lot of room for improvement here. And again, it's an example of where you need to understand a lot about musical structures because you need to generate structures that people can follow, understand them, and yet be able to detect when there's a change. And that is a non-trivial thing to do, what we realized. Okay, so again, there's a lot to improve on that part. I think I basically said that already, right? So what patterns can they perceive? How can we automatically compose this music that's more complex? But also, how do we measure the changes that the client is doing in the gameplay? All right, now my last example gets back to music analysis. And that is, I said I started by analyzing musical pieces, and as a musicologist, we often think in terms of scores. But now it is about helping music therapists analyzing improvisations that come out of their music therapy and finding patterns and structures in those therapy sessions for helping them with a number of different things that I'm going to explain now. Okay, so what is the goal of a therapy session? So what is the goal of an improvisation together? So they theorize that musical processes are correlated with psychological processes. And so, for example, a musical change can indicate a change in the patient's inner state. For instance, there are people that are super repetitive when they start music therapy, and they cannot really get into a dialogue with the musical dialogue with or musical interaction with the therapist. That's actually the goal, to get into a dialogue. And so the therapist tries to encourage then changes in the client's playing so that they get out of their own world of just playing for themselves. And while they are doing their, improvisation, of course, also the therapist is there with their full attention of, what's going on in the music. But after the session, they sit down with the recording and they reflect on, okay, so what happened? In what way did the patient interact? Did I see any changes? For instance, in which musical parameters is the patient very rigid, and what interventions changed that? So there is, again, a looking into what are patterns that get repeated or not repeated, and in what parameters do they occur? And how can you describe those emerging or not emerging musical structures in therapy sessions? So we sat together with the music therapist, Katrin Foubet and Joste Bakker, and we identified areas, okay, where would pattern discovery be of help for them? And so this is what they came up with. So there is a distinction between active music therapy, that is music making, and receptive, that is listening to music. And there are also probably ways of, employing it in listening if you want to find out who is interested in what music, but we focused here on active music therapy. And here the parts are using it for improvisation or for composition and songwriting. So composition and songwriting also can come out of improvisation when they start to write down what were the most important patterns and then go on from the improvisation to then compose a song. Okay. Now, and why would they want? Again, the question of how could computation help? Why? Well, if a patient comes, every week again, over weeks and months, you can imagine how much musical material that is a music therapist has to analyze. Specifically, if you want to monitor what is the progress from one week to the next week. Has the playing style changed, yes or not? So it helps to reduce the manual work. And it's also, a way of giving them like more of an objective tool, so to speak, because you need to imagine that they have been part of the improvisation themselves. I think that's even more difficult than taking a musical piece of someone else and starting to analyze that. But in this case, it's something that they have been part of the musical production and now need to, step back a bit to look at what has been produced and to analyze it. And so their technology also can come in and help, in this process of a tool of trying to do it in a rather objective way, if you want to call it like that. And what is the challenge? Similar to the musicologists at the Mertens Institute who said, please build us a search engine that can capture similarity. And then they had trouble for us defining what similarity is. The same applies with therapists who address very high-level concepts, like something like tension. Yes, here's tension occurring. And they are not immediately translatable into typical MIR features. So I foresee that we need to do something similar as what I described with the folk songs, where we sit down together with interviews and then design this annotation study. I think we need to do the same thing with the music therapist. I just give you one example from Joste Bakker. I said, okay, here is something that is really we could use for using computational tools. He wants to be able to distinguish for patients with psychosis the three playing styles. So one is called sensorial play. That is when they come, it's very monotonous. There's no phrasing, there's no silence, there's no dynamics. It's very chaotic. And they want to move in the end to what they call musical form. There is then a pulse, there's a phrase, there's dynamical differentiation. So there are structures that they can produce together in a musical improvisation. And in between is what he calls moments, or not only he, but many music therapists, moments of synchronicity. Those are short moments where those players do have a shared feeling of a free playing and being in an interaction. And this is kind of you want to move from sensorial period to musical form via those moments of synchronicity. Yeah, and the way he describes it, there is a lot of, musical structures in it. But still, we are very far from being already able to capture that into a computational model, because we need to much better understand what they mean with, free playing, autonomous, and all of these high-level concepts. But I think, again, it's a very worthwhile endeavor to use computational music analysis in that area. Okay. And I probably have said that already also. So we need to, of course, get those recordings. We need to have annotations and then explicate these concepts of tension, integration, and so on into potential computational features, and also figure out how much, again, music therapists agree or disagree in their analysis and intervention methods. Similar to a musicologist analyzing a musical score. Okay. So to wrap up, I've showed you examples of how we extract structures from musical pieces by means of computation, and then use structures to develop new forms of interaction. And my topic was the dialogue. So I was saying, okay, so what do I see as the opportunities of the dialogue of those three disciplines here? So MIR, has centered around what I call tasks for model evaluation. So we have kind of extracted things into like very concrete tasks like beat extraction, words, patterns, melodies, the way I have done as well. And we have also in this area, established very rigorous methods of evaluation. How do we know when a model works well or not? And often the more specific the task, the more rigorous the evaluation is. But music making and listening is, of course, something different than, it's way more holistic than these super specialized tasks. And you realize that when you then go to music therapy, because that's, a way more complex and holistic context. So how do we get then, these tasks into that context? But it does provide us, very useful use cases of why we want to model these structures in MIR. For instance, for being able to, compose music for a game that is predictable and unpredictable at the same time for the patient. But there's also the question of, when is an MIR model good enough to justify that we can use it in a therapy context, because you're working with vulnerable participants. So I don't want to start with a complete messy pattern discovery algorithm. Yeah, that doesn't work. Really not in this context. And how do I see the role of musicology? Well, obviously, our rich knowledge on musical structures is totally essential for these applications in music therapy. We really need it there. And I think and I hope that the computational approaches to these musical structures allow us to widen and deepen our knowledge on these musical structures that we want to employ in those new interactive forms. Okay. Thank you for listening. I'm open to questions.